Sorry, John, I can't hear your audio. Maybe that's just me.
No, not hearing you either, John.
Now?
Yeah,
Better?
good.
Okay. I'll start again. So, greetings everyone from Milltown, County Kerry. Welcome to what will be an extremely interesting talk on a key event in the War of Independence in this part of Ireland, the Ballymacandy ambush, as it's known. I was delighted to be asked by Liam to introduce this talk this evening on behalf of Trasna Natira. Let me say from the outset that I have a personal interest in the event, as my grandfather, John Heffernan, known as Captain Jack, was one of the volunteers who was present as a scout on the day of the ambush in June 1921. Our speaker tonight is Owen O'Shea from Milltown itself, so a local man. And for those of you not familiar with Kerry, Milltown village is located roughly halfway between Killarney and Tralee. And the site of the ambush, Ballymacandy itself, is located roughly halfway between Milltown and Castlemaine. Owen is a historian and the author of several books on Kerry. I won't go into them all, but one of the better known ones is The Heir to the Kingdom, Kerry's Political Dynasties, published in 2011. He currently works in the area of media and communications with Kerry County Council, and is also an Irish Research Council funded PhD student at UCD, researching politics in Kerry in the decade after the Civil War. Tonight's talk on the Ballymacandy ambush is the focus of a new book by Owen, just published by Marion Press, setting out the background to the ambush, what actually happened on the day, and what happened to the protagonists after the event itself. It is an important contribution, I hope you will all agree, to our understanding of this period in Irish history, and also brings home the axiom that all history is ultimately local, tied to places, people, and events. Just as a bit of background, my own area of research is the Irish big house, great houses, the Irish landed gentry, particularly those of Kerry. And I was delighted to help Owen when researching his book, about giving him information about the inhabitants of the two local big houses here in Milltown, who it turns out played an important part in this saga. You will hear mention to Major Markham Richard Leeson, Marshal of Candafercy, later on. Now, before I hand over to Owen, I'm just going to give you a basic 2-minute quick tour outline of events in Kerry during this period to place Ballymacandy in context. As many of you will already know, the general election of December 1918 saw 4 Sinn Féin MPs return for Kerry, who of course did not take their seats in Westminster, but in the first Dáil held in Dublin in January 1919. This, I think, gives you a very clear sense of how the Republican ambitions for independence had taken hold already so strongly in this part of the country. While there were various sporadic attacks on barracks, post offices, and big houses in Kerry in 1919, it was really in 1920 that you saw a definitive escalation in the conflict, with attacks and raids on various RIC barracks across the county. For example, Scartaglen, Brosna, Rathmore, Farranfore, among others. The machinery of government in Kerry was effectively neutralised by the IRA by mid-1920. And the government-sanctioned response by the RIC, now supplemented by the Black and Tans and auxiliaries, was to effectively terrorise the county in the late summer and autumn of 1920. Effectively, the attack led to counter-attack, reprisal led to counter-reprisal. So 1920-21 opened with a series of ambushes against the Crown forces, such as at Headford, Dispole and Rathmore, and which culminated in that at Ballymacandy on the 1st of June 1921. So just before I hand over to Owen, who will take us through the Ballymacandy ambush, which was the last major event in the War of Independence in Kerry before the truce came into effect on the 11th of July, just please remember that you can post questions to Owen in the chat box at the end of your screen, and we put them to him at the end of the presentation. So now over to you, Owen.
Thank you, John. Can I just check you're hearing me first of all? Very good. Good evening, everyone, and thanks very much in the first instance to To my two neighbours from Milltown, this is very much a Milltown County Kerry event tonight in many ways, not least because of the subject matter, but also because Liam, a neighbour of mine from Milltown, and John, who has just spoken, we're all neighbours. So really delighted to have been asked some time ago by Liam to say a few words tonight about something that I've been researching for a couple of years indeed, and to talk about an incident that happened so close to my home and close to where I was born and grew up many years ago. So I'm going to share my screen, which I'm hoping you can see, and just bear with me for a second. Can somebody let me know if that's visible to everybody?
That's fine, Owen.
Good stuff. I'll just go to slide mode. So thanks to John for the introduction and for setting the scene and for, I suppose, setting in context the events that I'm talking about tonight. As I say, this is a story that I learned about or grew up with as a young person. It literally happened as the crow flies, 2 or 3 fields across away from my home. And I just felt compelled as the centenary of the event approached to find out more, because very little had been written or recorded about what happened at Ballymacandy, and notwithstanding the fact that it claimed, the incident claimed 5 lives, and that it came so close to the end of the War of Independence. And in fact, a lot of what had been published and recorded about it was in some cases inaccurate and in some cases incomplete. So I was anxious to, I suppose, as the centenary of events approached, to ensure that what happened in the War of Independence 100 years ago in my community was documented. And to achieve that, I looked at some of the official archive sources, as well as talking to some of the descendants of the people involved, some of which I'll come on to in a few moments. So I suppose I've tried to set out here briefly what the significance of this ambush and this incident was and is in the greater scheme of things, and in this period during our history. As has been mentioned, it's an ambush that occurred just 6 weeks before the truce, and as such, as John has said, was one of the final major incidents of the War of Independence in Kerry, and certainly in my locality, which is Mid Kerry, it's probably certainly one of the most significant or the largest incidents of its kind in that area during the conflict, and certainly the one which had greatest impact on the community in which I was born and live. It claimed also significantly, I suppose, that the lives of the last Black and Tans who were killed in the conflict in Kerry, who I'll speak about in a moment. And I suppose 2 of the significant, if you like, findings of my research, or some of the conclusions that I reach in the book that I've published. One is to focus on some efforts, at least by the authorities, the military authorities, to spread the blame and to, I suppose, fail to accept that by this point in the conflict, the military strategy, or the strategy of the Crown Forces, was failing and failing miserably in Kerry and in Ireland indeed. And secondly, this ambush is particularly significant, I think, because remarkably and quite significantly, Milltown and Castlemaine and the surrounding areas were spared the reprisals that were such a feature of the War of Independence, particularly following the arrival of the Black and Tans, and which invariably followed attacks on the Crown Forces. But as we'll see shortly, Milltown was spared, thankfully, and the civilian population was spared the reprisals and the retaliation that had come to typify what became the reign of terror, if you like, of the Black and Tans in Ireland at the time. This is an image of Milltown village, and indeed, looking from the Kilorton side, the route which the police party would have travelled on the morning of the ambush on their way from Kilorton to Tralee, which I'll refer to in a moment. So Milltown, as John has explained, was then a small village. It's now a small town 100 years later, but at the time it was a busy small village. It was these are some images from close to that period. It was I suppose quite an important location in Kerry. It was kind of the intersection, as it still is, of the main artery from north to south in the county, and similarly the main route from Killarney and on towards Dingle, as it still is today. And the village was very much, I suppose, dominated in many ways, or at least its story and its history is very closely related to and interconnected with Kilcolman Abbey, which was the home of the Godfrey family, who had been a resident in Milton for many hundreds of years, and who were the local landowners, and at the time of the War of Independence, the resident head of the family was Sir William Cecil Godfrey. And what's one of the interesting themes in the book, or in the research I've done, is how that how the family and how the landed gentry, if you like, of that period in Milltown and in Mid-Kerry generally, how they coped with, how they reacted to, how they were impacted by events, and for the most part, in general terms, Kilcolman Abbey and the Godfrey family escaped some of the types of incidents to which many of their peers were subjected, particularly by the IRA, and I'll allude to some of the reasons for that maybe later. But principally, that was because, for the most part, the Godfrey family were quite popular, I suppose, in Milton, insofar as large landowners of that period were popular. But at least if they didn't, if you like, experience the type of resistance or the type of violence that was meted out to so many others like that around Kerry and around Ireland. The RIC the Royal Irish Constabulary had a large barracks in Milltown, just opposite the entrance to the Godfrey home, Kilcolman Abbey, and this is a picture from the front of the barracks with a number of members of the RIC from 1914, according to the caption on the picture. And I suppose it's just illustrative of the type of uniforms they wore, the bicycles, the attire, and what the RIC man looked like at the time. The building which they're standing in front of still exists. It's on the corner of the main street in the village. And among those who lived in and who was posted to Milltown was Sgt James Cullery, and I mention him, or I suppose single him out in particular, because he's one of the principal characters in the book, insofar as I've tried to tell the story as much from the RIC perspective as from the perspective of the IRA, and I've traced Sgt Cullery's story through the book in parallel with the story of Dan Mulvihill from the IRA, who I'll speak to in a moment, or speak about in a moment. But Sgt Cullery is probably significant insofar as one of the victims of the ambush, or one of those who was killed. He was the only married man and the only man with children, and he lived in the square in Milltown with his wife Catherine and 9 children. And I suppose his story is one of the transition from being a relatively well-liked and popular local policeman before the War of Independence to being caught up in the conflict, and I suppose caught up and associated with the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries and their actions and activities in the county. So his story is one that I was curious about, simply because he lived with his family and was living in and immersed in the community, the same community from which came the IRA men who led the attack, which ultimately led to his death. So I wanted to mention briefly, just in the RIC context, what I called the Milltown Mutiny, simply because it happened after the Listowel Mutiny in 1920, and the Listowel Mutiny is probably one of the better known events, if you like, of the period in Kerry. And it involves the divisional commissioner with the RIC, Colonel Smith, who's pictured on the left, who was sent around to a number of the RIC barracks in Kerry at the time to to really give the RIC members a pep talk. This was just before the arrival of the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries, and essentially he was, or he instructed his men and advised his men that they really needed to up their game, that the IRA was getting an upper hand in the conflict, that the RIC tactics were simply failing. He made very clear to the men in the barracks in Milltown when he visited in the summer of 1920 that they needed to be prepared to shoot and shoot to kill. That there was, I suppose the normal rules of warfare, insofar as they could be applied, no longer applied, and that the RIC would soon be supplemented by a new force, which was being sent to Ireland by the British government to crush the IRA. During his visit to the barracks in Milltown, one of the RIC constables took off his belt and put down his revolver and told the divisional commissioner that he wouldn't participate in any of this, that when he had joined the RIC, he didn't envisage having to kill Irish men and Irish women. And he subsequently left the Constabulary. But what the event highlights, I suppose, and the reason I mention it, is that that transition from the RIC becoming, if you like, a regular police force, to becoming targets for the IRA, and to becoming part of that more, if you like, enhanced military presence in Kerry and in Ireland in the summer of 1920. And caught up, I suppose, in all of the middle of that, who I've circled here in the centre, was Sgt James Cullery that I mentioned a moment ago. So Milltown, just by way of background, was, followed a similar trajectory to other villages and towns around the country. In the early 1900s, groups like the Ancient Order of the Hibernians were mentioned here, became active. All of the social and cultural organisations that became part of the revolutionary period are present in Milltown and Castlemaine and in the wider Mid-Kerry area at the time. This is a picture which is happens to be on the back cover of my book, of the volunteers in Milltown. I'm estimating about 1918 or 1919. Curiously enough, this picture, even though they're out of shot, on the left of this picture is the entrance to the Kilcolman Abbey, the home of the Godfrey family, and just on the other side was the other side of the square was the RIC barracks. So, the IRA, or the volunteers at this time, obviously weren't deterred by that, and were becoming more, if you like, more visible and more active, and were ready to, I suppose, step up their game and take up arms and engage in what became the War of Independence from 1919, and particularly in Mid-Kerry from early to mid 1920 onwards. I want to mention in passing another ambush, simply by way of or because of its connection with Ballymacandy, and that's the Hillville ambush of the 31st of October of 1920. And the reason I mention it here is because I consider it to be one of the most significant contributory factors to Ballymacandy, if that makes sense, in the sense that it was an ambush, an event that had repercussions that played out really at Ballymacandy a number of months later. And in very brief summary, it involved an attack by Callan Firstly and Listry IRA Companies near Kilordan at a place called Hillville at Halloween 1920, which led to the death of 2 Black and Tans. And the reprisals which were unleashed in Kilordan and in Milltown were quite significant, and led to civilians being attacked, shot at, injured, homes, properties being burned. The type of incidents and attacks that John referred to in his introduction, and it included a familiar face on the right, Dan Allman, who from Listry, or Rockfield to Listry, who was one of those who died at Headford Junction, which John mentioned. It was even raised in the House of Commons by Hammer Greenwood, the Chief Secretary for Ireland, which is there on the top left. And I just picked out one couple on the bottom left there, Sonny Mason, who was with the Kiltala IRA, and his wife Amelia Mason, who was a member of Cumann, as an example of that reprisal regime of the Black and Tans. Their home was attacked in the aftermath of Hillville. Amelia Mason was dragged from her home, ordered from her home. She was known to hide guns and weapons for the IRA. If you like, the retaliation and the reprisals for the Hillville ambush in October 1920 had repercussions right through the way to Ballymacandy, and really following that incident, the civilian population in Mid-Kerry did really feel the brunt of the worst excesses of Black and Tan retaliation. I do have a video on my YouTube channel about Hillville if anybody would like to find out more information about that. Just briefly to explain some of the IRA companies we're talking about that were involved with Ballymacandy, and I've taken this from the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, and it just points out, I suppose, the structure of the battalions and the brigades in the IRA at the time, which I won't go into in so much detail, but you can see there in the centre some of the companies that I'll be talking about: Milltown, Keel, Kiltala, who were involved, some from the Kerry 2 battalion, some from Kerry 2 brigade, others from Kerry 1. And as I'll mention in a minute, the local Mid-Kerry IRA companies that were involved at Ballymacandy were supplemented by members of the Tralee IRA who'd been hiding out for quite a period in West Kerry. But that just, that map, and indeed all of the maps in the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, which I think every home in Ireland should have one, as they say, is a very helpful guide to illustrating the IRA companies and the structures that we're talking about. To mention, I suppose, some of the better known figures, if I could put it that way, who were involved at Ballymacandy, just by way of an introduction really, some of which would be well-known names in Kerry, some of which even beyond Kerry, I would suggest. And I've just picked a couple of them here. Dan Keating, who's probably one of the best known figures of the War of Independence, not least because he lived to the great age of 105 and only died in 2007, and was a lifelong committed Republican, and who was the oldest surviving veteran of the War of Independence when he died. Two other men in the centre who were involved in the ambush, and I include them because they both went on to become Teachtaí Dála. One being Jack Flynn from Castlemaine, who from 1932 onwards was a Fianna Fáil TD for South Kerry, and Johnny Connor of Farmers Bridge near Tralee, better known as Johnny Machine Gun Connor, for reasons which I let you figure out. But he went on to become a Clonmel Public TD for North Kerry in 1954, and finally Tom O'Connor. I've included his picture here because he was the officer commanding of the IRA and effectively led the attack on the day. And Tom O'Connor was from Milltown. Later lived in Culloden, emigrated for a while, and lived out his later years in Clonmel in County Tipperary. So they're just some of the dramatist personae that we're talking about. The accounts I've used in terms of the participants that I spoke about are from the military archives, are from lists, handwritten lists in almost all cases that were provided by those involved in later years, such as here the Kiltala Company, and on the right some of the members of the Keel IRA who were involved. So again, as I've said before in other talks I've given, and probably will say it again tonight, the military archives, what's now available online, is such a hugely vast and accessible resource, and so valuable when it comes to telling the stories that we're talking about here. I mentioned some of the Tralee IRA and from the Kerry No. 1 Brigade, and from the period after the siege of Tralee in November 1920, and certainly from the early spring of 1921, a lot of the very senior figures in the Tralee IRA were hiding out at a place called Fibuck in Keel, which is between Castlemaine and Inch on the Dingat Peninsula, at a dugout or a hideout which became known as the Hut. And the leader there was Paddy Cahill, top left, who was a TD elected in the May 1921 general election. And Paddy Cahill and many of his men had been, as I say, forced to flee Tralee and go on the run after the siege of Tralee. And with him at the Hut were men like Jerry Miles, left centre, Billy Mullins, bottom left, well-known names from the conflict in Kerry. People like Jerry Unkie O'Connor, top right, Big Dan O'Sullivan, as he was known, and also present were some members of the Castle Gregory IRA, and included there at the bottom right is Tyke Brosnan, a blacksmith from Castle Gregory, who was one of the more formidable foes of the Crown forces in the Dingle Peninsula in the period. From the middle of the spring of 1921, these and other men like them were hiding out in the mountains of the Dingle Peninsula, including here at the hut at Fibuck, and from there they led and participated in many of the attacks and ambushes of the period, including, as we'll see, at Ballymacandy on the 1st of June. I want to just mention briefly the role of the women of Cumann, which has been very much, I think, overlooked and understated, at least until recent years, thanks to the accounts that are now being published and some of the research that's being done. But the notion of Cumann being a sort of a force in the background, or a group in the background that were simply, if you like, making the tea and darning the socks of the IRA men as they went about their business, really is a perception that has rightfully changed in recent years. And in so many cases, many of the women of Cumann put their safety and their lives on the line at frequent intervals. The woman on the left here is just as an example, Nellie Foley, who with her sister Nellie Corcoran, it was her own name, and her sister Nora, who's second from the left, at their home in Bulteens, they operated what they call in the accounts a dressing station, which was used to tend to and deal with or provide medical care to IRA men who were injured in conflict. And I've actually done some recordings and some videos on my YouTube channel about some of the Cumann women in Mid-Kerry, whose accounts are now emerging for the first time and provide us with such great and rich detail about some of the activities that they were involved in this period. So to turn to the ambush at Ballymacandy itself, which occurred 100 years ago yesterday. In fact, the sketch map here that I've drawn is actually from the military archives, and it was a sketch drawn by hand by Dan Mulvihill, who's there on the top right, who lived at Brackhill in Castlemaine, just a very short distance from the site of the ambush indeed, and who has indicated here on the map where the ambush took place, which I'll detail in more detail in a minute on a better map. So if you like, the first person alerted to the prospect of an ambush on the 1st of June 21 was Dan Mulvihill, because the RIC party of 12 who would ultimately come under attack, they left Killordan, their barracks in Killordan, on the morning of the 1st of June to cycle to Tralee to collect their pay. And because the IRA had become very adept at cutting trenches in the roads and making the roads impassable for four-wheeled vehicles, for cars and trucks, cycling was considered the best way of the best means of transportation for the members of the RIC. But of course the bicycle might have been a better mode of transport, but it certainly wasn't a safer mode of transport. So at about 10:30, 11 o'clock that morning, Dan Mulvihill, who was at his home at Brackhill making ammunition with his sister, who was a member of Cumann, and other local members, neighbours of his who were in the IRA, he got a tip-off that the Black and Tans had been seen travelling by bicycle from Killordan through Milltown, through Castlemaine, and on towards Tralee. And immediately Mulvihill recognised the opportunity for an attack. Curiously enough, about a week previously, a similar police patrol had passed through, and an effort had been made to launch an ambush at that point, but for various reasons it didn't come off. But on this occasion, Mulvihill, once he received the information that the IRA or the RIC party had travelled to Tralee and knew that they would be coming back in the afternoon, most likely along the same road, sent word to the IRA companies in the locality in Milltown and Kiltala and in Keele, and also sent word to the hut at Fibuck that I mentioned a moment ago, to alert the IRA there that there was the prospect of an attack in the Milltown and Castlemaine area, and to mobilise and to prepare. And the other picture there, as I say, is of Tom O'Connor, who was officer commanding and who would lead the ambush on that afternoon. The accounts we have and that I've used in the book really come from the witness statements of people like Jimmy Cronin, who's pictured here at the top, and Paddy Paul Fitzgerald of Tralee on the right, and also the Cumann accounts that I spoke about earlier on. They weave the story together, I suppose, and when supplemented by other private and unpublished accounts that I've managed to unearth over the years, they help us to complete a story of what actually happened during the ambush itself. So this maybe looks like a complicated map, but I've tried to keep it as simple as possible, and I'm very conscious that there's people from as far away as the United States, I believe, in this call, so they mightn't be as intimately familiar with the geography of Milltown and Castlemaine as I am. So I'll try and explain what happened. But I've circled here in red really the ambush zone, or the scene of the ambush, which was on the main road between Castlemaine village and Milltown village, and the two stars, or two asterisks, if you like, indicate the area within which the attack occurred. By the time the RIC and Black and Tans, I should say that the dozen men who were on their bikes consisted of a mixture of RIC and Black and Tans. While they were in Tralee, the IRA had mobilised and had managed to gather at Castlemaine, and they decided, after some deliberation, to lie in wait at both sides of the road between the two stars that I've and within that red circle that I have on the screen. So they decided to spread out basically along that straight stretch of road with Ballymacandy on one side and Clunmore on the other side, and to hide out in the ditches and in the hedgerows, effectively on either side of the road, armed with weapons, and on the assumption that when the police patrol would come along the road, they would be targets for the attack, or for attack. But I'm by no means a military historian, but from what I've read about the ambush zone or ambush site, it wasn't an obvious a location from which to launch an ambush. It was flat land. It didn't have any elevation. It didn't have a lot of trees or forestry to both provide cover for attack, but also to provide cover for people to get away. But I think Dan Mulvihill in one account says it was a good location because there was no location, and that's the element of surprise, which obviously was so critical to all of these ambushes, was very much a factor in ultimately their choosing of that location. Some of the I've just put in where Dan Mulvihill lived, and you can see at the other end of the map where Sgt Cullery lived in Milton, just to show how really close they were to where the incident happened. And the picture of the cottage is one of Clonmore Cottage, which is one of the cottages where the IRA lay in wait. So at the RIC and Black and Tan party arrived back in, came back out from Tralee in the early afternoon, and they stopped off at Griffin's Bar in Castlemaine for a drink. It was a very, very hot summer's day, warm summer's day, in stark contrast to the weather we've had the last couple of days. While in Castlemaine, and this was one of the remarkable aspects of the story, I think, while in Castlemaine, the district inspector Michael Francis McCaughey and his men received several warnings, in fact, both from civilians and others, that the IRA had been seen about the place, that they were active in the area that morning, and that the prospect of attack or that the prospect of an ambush was a very real one. And extraordinarily, despite all these warnings, the district inspector insisted that he would return to his barracks with his men on the same route they had travelled that morning. Now, they did give thought for a while to travelling back to Culloden via the railway line, which is here on the map, which ran to the north of Ballymacandy, and by which they would have avoided the main road. But McCaughey is reported to have said that he would not turn off his road for any shinners, and that he would return to his barracks, and if there was going to be an attack, he'd fight it out with any of them. So there seemed to be a certain element of bravado and naivety on the part of the leader of the RIC Black and Tan group, which ultimately proved very costly. So in summary, as the police group continued to cycle on towards Milltown, all 12 of the cycling party, to call it that, ended up within that ambush zone. And about 3:30 or 4 o'clock, as District Inspector McCaughey and Sgt Cullery, who were leading the group on their bicycles, as they approached what was known as Pensioner Shea's cottage, which was a cottage occupied by a retired London policeman known as Pensioner Shea. Tom O'Connor from behind the hedges and the ditches gave the order to open fire, and essentially by this point, the 12 RIC and Black and Tans were effectively entrapped, because the IRA came out onto the road at either end of the ambush zone, where the stars are on this map, and began to open fire. So essentially those being attacked were under fire from all sides and really had very, very little opportunity to defend themselves, and killed immediately within the first couple of minutes were the District Inspector, Michael Francis McCaughey, who was a member of the Black and Tans, and Sgt James Cullery, who I spoke about and mentioned a moment ago, and who was a resident of the village. Two other constables, which I'll detail in a moment, died in the following half hour of the conflict, and one survived for a period, and would ultimately die a day and a half later, which I'll come on to in a moment. The ambush itself lasted about, by all accounts, between 30 and 45 minutes, and in the immediate aftermath of the ambush, once it was over, the IRA scattered in all directions and returned to their homes in many cases, and in other cases not so, because they were aware that they would be possibly discovered or their homes raided subsequent to events. Several of the RIC and Black and Tans did escape and managed to make their way back to Culloden to their barracks, some of them quite badly wounded, some of them returning via the railway line, another getting onto the Killarney Road and managing to convince a local farmer with a horse and cart to transport him to Culloden. So the details of those who were killed, the ambush claimed 5 lives. District Inspector McCaughey, who I mentioned, Sgt James Cullery, who I mentioned also, Constable John Quirk, who's pictured here on the right, who was from County Cork. McCaughey, I should say, was from County Down, and Sgt Cullery was originally a native of County Sligo. Constable Joseph Cooney, who was another RIC constable, who was killed, and finally Constable John Stratton McCormack, who wasn't killed initially, but who lay bleeding on the road for an hour or two before he was moved to a nearby cottage, to Pensioner Shea's cottage, and who was treated there overnight by the local doctor, Dr. Sheehan, which I'll come to in a moment. In terms of some of those who play an important part in the immediate aftermath of the ambush, and whose accounts I detail in the book, Father Sandy O'Sullivan was the curate in Milltown, and he heard the gunfire and heard the shots and rushed to the scene and tended to the dead and the dying, and indeed, while he was praying over Constable Cooney, who was dying and bleeding heavily, Constable Cooney is reported to have whispered into the priest's ear that he made a reference to an incident in nearby Glencar several months earlier, in which an IRA man called Joe Taylor was killed, and he's said to have told Father Sandy O'Sullivan that tell the lads in Glencar that I didn't shoot Joe Taylor. So there was if you like, almost a dying statement from one of the constables who had been injured. Father Sandy O'Sullivan is an interesting character in that he had been a chaplain with the British Army during the First World War, and ended up being posted back post the war to Milltown, and he was curiously he was condemnatory of the activities of the IRA, as so many of the clergy were at the time. But there are accounts of him hearing confessions and praying with IRA men before they went and participated in attacks and assaults. So it's quite a curious combination of I suppose maybe the difficult position of the local clergy insofar as the hierarchy was condemning the activities of the IRA, yet obviously Father Sandy and others like him saw these men as his parishioners and felt the need to minister to them or to provide them with a certain amount of support. Dr. Dan Sheehan, who I'll talk about in a moment, was the local doctor. He happened to be the medical officer of the Kerry Kerry No. 1 Brigade at the time, and he was first to the scene and was involved in treating some of the dying men, including Constable McCormack, who he arranged to have moved off the road and treated in a nearby cottage. And he was taken to the scene or alerted to the incident by William Quinton, who's pictured there on the right, who was a retired RIC sergeant who lived in the square in Milton, and again had heard the gunfire. And William Quinton's account of what he discovered when he went to the scene is very graphic, in which he describes the injuries of those of the men who had been wounded and were dying, and is one of the most important accounts we have of the incident. The four of the dead men were removed that evening to the Sacred Heart Church in Milltown, and they were received there by Father Sandy OSullivan, the curate, who I mentioned a moment ago, and he interestingly maintained an overnight vigil with the remains and remained in the church throughout the night with the four deceased, including Sgt Cullery, of course, whose wife and children who lived just down the street and who were brought to pay their respects. It was interesting. I thought that the priest decided to remain in the church overnight until they were removed to Ballymullen Barracks in Tralee the following day for postmortems. And Sergeant Cullery indeed is the only victim of the attack who's buried in the locality, and is buried in the local abbey, the Abbey of Callaha, near Milltown, and he's buried there with his wife and 3 daughters. The Military Court of Inquiry, really in brief, just to refer to it, it opened 2 days after the ambush at the barracks in Ballymullen, and as people may be aware, formal inquests, as we know them today, had been effectively suspended during the War of Independence, and there weren't any formal inquests like that, but rather what was held was military inquiries into these type of events, and they were presided over by British Army, British Army officials, and the accounts of the proceedings of the Court of Inquiry are held in the British Archives and thankfully are available online. And the picture on the left actually is the hospital wing of Ballymullen Barracks in Tralee, which is where the five men who died were taken. Constable McCormack, who had remained at the cottage in Ballymacandy overnight, eventually succumbed to his injuries when he eventually arrived at the hospital in Ballymullen in the early hours of the 3rd of June. Probably, so it's probably the most significant or important element of the Military Court of Inquiry in terms of our story is that Dr. Dan Sheehan gave quite a lot of evidence about what he did and how he tended to the dead and the dying, and particularly how he treated Constable McCormack, who, as I say, was kept overnight in the nearby cottage. In summary, really, there was an effort made by the inquiry to suggest that Dr. Sheehan had failed or had provided inadequate treatment to Constable McCormack as he lay dying on the floor of a nearby cottage overnight. And despite accounts that Dr. Sheehan gave of providing morphine to the dying man and to attending to him a number of occasions during the night, and despite reassurances that he got from the military authorities who had arrived in Milton that an ambulance was on the way, or that at least help was on the way, and that Constable McCormack would be removed to Tralee, this didn't happen until the following day, and when Constable McCormack was removed to Ballymullen by a special train, along with the deceased. But if you study closely the evidence of the Military Court of Inquiry, there seems to be an effort by the military authorities to blame Dr. Sheehan for not doing more to treat Constable McCormack, which is sort of an interesting dynamic, I think, in the whole story, despite Dr. Sheehan saying, as I've quoted here, that he was under the impression that arrangements were being made to have him taken away. And Dr. Sheehan ultimately was a local, if you like, country doctor who didn't have access to the type of perhaps medicine or materials that may have been required, supplies that may have been required to treat what was a very badly injured man. He had sustained a bullet wound to the neck and was bleeding heavily. There was an attempt subsequently, this is also a picture of Dr. Sheehan in later life, there's a handwritten note on the Military Court of Inquiry file, which I thought was interesting, which asks a question, one military officer asking another, if there was enough evidence to have Dr. Sheehan struck off the medical register on account of his perceived inadequate treatment of the only surviving and dying Black and Tan Constable McCormack. But here, one of his superiors types back a note saying that there didn't seem to be enough evidence in this regard, and that one needed to be certain of the facts, and that if that was the account Dr. Sheehan gave at the Military Court of Inquiry, that was that, and it was time to move on. Dr. Sheehan, incidentally, was arrested several weeks later by the Black and Tans, coincidentally on the day of the truce, or the day the truce was announced, at least the 8th of July, and he was taken into custody for a while, but was subsequently released and went on to serve as the local medical doctor, as his family still do in the vicinity 100 years later. The ultimate conclusion of the Military Court of Inquiry was that persons unknown by the side of the public highway about midway between Castlemaine and Milltown in the county of Kerry, that they had carried out the attack, and that, quote, such persons unknown are guilty of willful murder, which was one of the main and one of the many conclusions of the Court of Inquiry. The other interesting aspect of the story, or the one that fascinated me, and I mentioned at the beginning, was how come Milltown or Castlemaine or anywhere in Mid-Kerry didn't experience the reprisals that ordinarily or almost always followed ambushes or attacks on the Crown forces of this nature? Because I was expecting to find in my research some reference to the fact that the Black and Tans would have returned to Milltown that night or the following day and set fire to properties and attacked civilians in the same way as they had done in the aftermath of the Hillville ambush at the end of October 1920. But I couldn't find any references to any such attacks. Now, it should be said that around this time, I think the official government policy, or at least the official military policy in relation to reprisals, was that they were no longer part of official policy, if you like, and that there was an effort made. I think there was a recognition on the part of the military authorities to some extent that reprisals were actually having the opposite effect to which they were intended, and were only fueling the cycle of violence. But I did find a clue in a diary entry from a gentleman by the name of Major Markham Richard Leeson Marshall, who was a major with the Royal Munster Fusiliers and who lived at Callanafercy House between Milltown and Killordan, and who was married to a member of the Godfrey family of Kilcolman Abbey, and who was, again, you know, a large Protestant landowner from the period, and who lived in the area, and thankfully through his diaries documented some of what a lot of what happened. But there's an interesting entry in his diary in the days after the ambush, in which he records receiving a note from the local IRA warning that quote, loyalists in the district, himself included, would be burnt out of their homes by the IRA if there were reprisals for Ballymacandy. And the note was sent apparently by Tom O'Connor, the officer commanding at Ballymacandy. And Tom O'Connor claims that the major went to Ballymullen Barracks to senior military figures there, warning them that if there were reprisals or attacks in response to Ballymacandy, that there would be further consequences for him and others like him. So I think it's an interesting clue to perhaps why there weren't the reprisals that were so typical of the period. And in fact, the story I grew up with as a child was that the military commanders who came out from Tralee were apparently moved or so impressed by the way in which local women had cleaned up the bodies of the dead men and laid them out in front of the altar in the church that he ordered that no reprisals should take place. But I must say, I was a bit skeptical about that notion that a hardened military commander would be so moved by the actions of a few local women like that. So I think for a couple of reasons, including this, if you like, threat from the IRA that if there were reprisals, there would be reprisals again from their side. It does give us an indication of how febrile things were at the time and how the War of Independence had become such a kind of a tit-for-tat conflict. Just briefly, the aftermath, and by way of trying to conclude, and I'm just conscious of time. The Cullery family, Sgt Cullery's family, his wife Catherine, who's pictured here on the left, and her then 8 children. One of them had died as a child, as a baby, and indeed she lost another child a couple of months after the ambush. So she and her then 7 children left Milltown in the days after the ambush and finished up living in Limerick City, where she lived with her family for the rest of her days, and where many of her family still live indeed. In terms of I suppose the impact on some of those on the IRA side who were involved in the ambush, in the immediate aftermath of or certainly within a year or two of the ambush, 5 of those who participated at Ballymacandy lost their lives. Billy Miles, in particular, who was the brother of Jerry, who I'll talk about in a minute, from Tralee, he died during the Civil War. John OSullivan, who was from Acashla and Castlegregory, who was present at Ballymacandy, he was also killed by the Free State Army during that conflict. Mossy Casey, who was a friend of Dan Mulvihill's, he was killed in October 1921 during the truce period while they were making explosives in a cottage in Malahave in Fireys. Another of those involved, Thomas McLaughlin, who actually was a former British Army, former British soldier who left the British Army to join the IRA and who lived in Kiltala. He, in very tragic circumstances, was clearly traumatized by both his what he had seen perhaps in World War I and what he had been involved in the War of Independence and the Civil War. He took his own life towards the end of the Civil War. And finally, Eddie Hannafin. Eddie was a member of the Fianna Éireann, the Scouts, on the day of the ambush, and lived slap bang in the middle of Ballymacandy. And in fact, a lot of the IRA men hid on his farm and in front of his house as they lay in wait for the police and the Black and Tans. But tragically, he drowned in the River Main, not far from his home, a short time after the ambush. So that just is a brief summary of accounting for some of those who lost their lives in the short period after the incident. Jerry Miles finally was the only injury. Actually, it was from an injury or casualties point of view for the IRA. I suppose the attack or the ambush could be considered a success insofar as they only sustained one injury, and that was Jerry Miles, who's there on the top left from Tralee. He sustained a gunshot wound to the chest, and he spent several months recuperating in a safe house in Glencar, in a very remote and rural part of South Kerry for many months, and was quite badly affected by that injury throughout his life. As I say, his brother, who's pictured here beside him, Billy Miles, was killed during the Civil War. And Jerry Miles was later a very prominent figure in the GAA. He was secretary of the Kerry County Board for a number of years and was chairman of his GAA club at John Mitchell's in Tralee. And I came across this photograph of his funeral in 1950, which actually made the front page of the Irish Press. And in it, I must try and find the original at some point, but in it you can see that some of the IRA veterans who were with Miles in the Castlemaine ambush in 1921 fired 3 volleys over the grave of Mr. Jerry Miles Tralee at Ra Cemetery. So I'd love to get a closer look and see how many of those who were with him at the Ballymacandy ambush stood there on that day in 1950, all those years later, firing shots over the grave in IRA or in that Republican tradition that continued for so long afterwards. But that is the story of Jerry Miles. So I suppose to conclude, where we are 100 years on is a place that I never thought we would get to when I started out on this research a couple of years ago. This is a picture that some of you might have seen in local press or online in recent days. According to accounts, Sgt Cullery, who was the RIC constable who, as I said, lived in Milton with his young family, he was killed in the ambush by Jerry Unkie O'Connor, who's pictured on the top right, because the accounts do say that Unkie O'Connor threw the grenade, the shrapnel of which knocked Constable or Sergeant Cullery off his bicycle and killed him. And I had been in contact with a number of families, the descendants of those who participated in the ambush, to find out more about their ancestors and obviously to assist with my research. And Mary O'Neill, who's pictured here on the left, from Dublin, who's a granddaughter of Sergeant Cullery, was in Kerry for a number of days and in Milltown in quite recently. And she met with the grandson of Jerry Unkie O'Connor. So you had a century later, almost to the day, the granddaughter of the RIC sergeant who died, meeting the grandson of the IRA man who killed him. And I thought it was quite a remarkable gesture or thing to do for Mary and for Dermot Cotter here, Jerry Unkie O'Connor's grandson, to meet and to share their stories. And I think what I took from it was that whereas they both have their own understandable interpretations or beliefs about what happened and what occurred, they were very respectful of each other's stories and of each other's interpretations of the events at Ballymacandy. But I thought that a century on, it was significant to some extent about maybe where we've come as a community or as a country or as a people, that the descendants of those involved in this very turbulent and traumatic period in our history can at least now come together and discuss in a mature and respectful way what happened in those very, very turbulent times. So my thanks to Mary and Dermot, and indeed all of the many descendants of those participants in the ambush who were so helpful and contributed to the story. So finally, in the best tradition of these things, a plug for the book, which thankfully, given the response and the interest, is already into its second print run, which I'm really thrilled with and somewhat humbled by. It's available, as they say, on all the programs in all good bookshops, through my own website, which is owenoshea.ie, and through the Marion Press website. My contact details are there for anybody via my own website or via my email. You'll find me on Twitter and Facebook as well. But that is the story of the Ballymacandy ambush, almost a century to the day since it took place. And I hope you found the discussion informative and engaging. And thank you very, very much for listening and for viewing.
Thank you, Owen. That was a fantastic insight into the events of Ballymacandy on the 1st of June 1921, as you say, nearly 100 years ago. The book and the talk, I think, really bring home the personal tragedy, the event for the RIC families in the first instance, and also I think the determination and bravery of the volunteers, that such odds were against them. I'll make a few more comments in a second, but anybody who has any questions for Owen, could you please post them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. I suppose, Owen, like looking back at what you've said tonight, I mean, what strikes me as really remarkable is really how young some of these men were, on both sides, and also how the volunteers, I suppose, took on this fight to achieve a better Ireland against the odds. I mean, it really strikes me, that they were their backgrounds and from where they were from. I mean, against a very much vastly superior force. I mean, it was really
Yeah.
an extraordinary thing. And it also strikes me as well, you know, that the RIC themselves must have found themselves in an impossible situation, because they were duty bound to uphold the law, yet their loyalties were now under severe strain. And I think what you say about Sergeant Cullery is quite interesting. I mean, the fact that he lived in Milltown, worshipped in Milltown, socialized in Milltown, sent his children to school in Milltown, you know, was genuinely liked, yet was probably killed by somebody he actually knew. And I think that really brings home the whole tragedy of war, regardless of one's views or background, you know. I suppose, you know, what also strikes me about this is that, you know, you've really done a service to this kind of whole area of research, and I think your book is a very balanced account of what happened, you know, and it's a valuable contribution, I think, to our understanding all the niceties of what went on in Kerry during this period, and also I suppose how it sheds light and how one event can impact a small, relatively self-contained village and community in rural Ireland. And it didn't matter whether you were Republican, Loyalist, Catholic, Protestant, Labourer, farmer, or from the big house.
Yeah.
It impacted across the community. I think that really strikes me as quite significant. But I see there's some questions, so I shall put a few to you now. From Liam, you allude to the location of the ambush not being a typical ambush site. Would it be fair to say, with superior numbers and the element of surprise, the volunteers were confident and never anticipated having to make a retreat from the ambush site?
Yeah, good question, because not several months previously, the IRA had launched an ambush at Kildare, which is between Milton and Kilordan, in a wooded area overlooking the road and offered that elevation. So it was curious that they chose, you know, a relatively flat landscape with few features like that. But I think, as Liam says here, I mean, the IRA significantly outnumbered the RIC and Black and Tans on the day. And if the lists I've compiled are anything to go by, between IRA and Scouts, you'd up to 60 or 70 people involved. So numerically alone, they very much had the upper hand. And I suppose in that regard, yes, regardless of where they'd have launched the ambush from, they had a very, very significant advantage militarily from that point of view. And certainly the element of surprise, I think too, was, you know, McCaughey, the district inspector, apparently did think that if there was to be an attack, it would be at the other side of Milltown, at Kildare, where they'd been ambushed previously. But obviously the IRA and Dan Mulvihill and Tom O'Connor and people like that recognised the element of surprise that straight stretch of road between Milltown and Castlemaine would provide.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite interesting to see. There was, you know, for in this particular instance, that the volunteers were definitely in the superior numbers. You know, one thing I think as well that I think Liam has touched on as well is, you know, there was a certain veil of silence over this whole event particularly after the Civil War. I mean, we didn't hear very much about it going to school. You kind of heard the general outline, but not the specifics. You know, how would you kind of justify that? What do you think was the cause of this kind of, you know, as I say, certain rhetoric about it?
Yeah, I think you're right to reference that, because if there's one thing that every descendant, almost every descendant of those involved in this ambush has said to me, is they didn't talk about it. So I suppose if the participants themselves didn't talk about it, or even if they did, you know, in private within their families, then the wider community perhaps inevitably didn't speak about it. So, but you're right. That silence, I suppose, continued for years and decades afterwards. And I can understand why those involved in the period didn't speak about it. It was a terribly traumatic time. Young men, as you say, had been involved in brutal murder on all sides of the conflict. Women had been involved in the conflict. Some women in particular had been on the receiving end of appalling and brutal violence, not just from the Black and Tans and from the RIC, but occasionally from the IRA themselves. So I can understand the trauma that would have caused that sort of that silence in the years afterwards. And I was always struck, as you mentioned it, about silence. Tom McEllistrom, or old Tommy Mac, the Fianna Fáil TD for North Kerry for 40 odd years, probably one of the most high profile leaders of the IRA in Kerry in this period, never spoke in the Dáil in his 46 years in the Dáil, or never spoke apparently from an election platform about this period, and repeatedly said this period was best confined to the past. And I can very much understand that, but I suppose it's now that we're 2-3 generations on, and that their accounts are being published online, and that we can read what they recounted in later years, that we're actually kind of can almost listen to them now and hear what they're saying.
Yeah, it's like ghosts from the past. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. I suppose, I know, kind of following on from that, kind of the same theme, like what surprised you the most when you were undertaking your research? I mean, was there anything you found that you didn't expect to find, or something that contradicted long-held ideals about this whole event?
Well, one of I no more than yourself, I knew very little about this growing up, or heard little about, other than little snippets, it would have been mentioned. But what I did grow up with was the story that the 5 men who died were black and tans, and of course, not all of them were. Now, in the IRA's eyes at the time, RIC, black and tan auxiliary, it didn't matter. Whoever was wearing the uniform were members of the Crown Forces and were legitimate targets. But I was curious that there's that kind of important distinction, I think, to be made between the likes of Sgt Cullery, who joined the RIC in Sligo in the late 1800s, and joined what was then the police force of the country, and ended up so many years later being caught up in that whole black and tan auxiliary. What Fergal Keane, who wrote his book on the North Kerry situation, calls that a messy amalgam of policing in Ireland at the time. And I suppose really, like, what surprised me is that there's kind of nothing, you can't apply universal motivations to some of, I was curious, like Dan Mulvihill, an IRA man, who was a lifelong avid and committed Republican. When he was in London as a young fella, he contemplated joining the Royal Air Force, according to his own account. So, like, what I've kind of concluded is that there's no simple narrative here that you can apply to all of this. There are nuances to all of this. There are, the accounts, while similar, and there are similar threads to all of this, the motivations of people involved and the type of people involved, all have such fascinating and different stories to tell, really.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's extraordinary, really, the diverse number of characters that are involved in this.
Yeah.
Some other questions for you. I have one here from Jerry Murphy. Did you ever come across evidence of Tans raiding houses in Ballymacandy itself on the night and threatened to burn them out?
There are one or two, not specifically Ballymacandy. There are one or two mentions in the papers, one if not two, of houses being burned, but they seemed to be weeks after the ambush, and I wasn't able to link them to Ballymacandy. But I have heard, families and descendants from that locality have told me of the kind of traumas that their ancestors experienced, some of which I didn't detail in the book because I didn't think it was either kind of fair to them or it was a bit kind of prurient. But in a lot of cases, there were significant mental health impacts on people who witnessed what happened, let alone those who participated, which is part of that trauma that I'm speaking about. That we can now speak a bit more freely, I suppose. But to answer the direct question, not exactly, but not exactly in terms of Ballymacandy itself, but at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if there were perhaps almost kind of one-off little retaliatory incidents or back and tans that mightn't have necessarily obeyed orders or so on. So,
yeah, I mean, there certainly was rumours after Ballymacandy that there would be severe reprisals, but as you say,
yes.
there is some suggestion that Major Marshall preempted that. I see a question here also from John Murphy about the RIC barracks being Shawnee Carey's house. I can answer that myself. It's actually Cosgrave's pub John, if you're familiar with Milltown.
Yeah.
That was the RIC barracks. Another question here from Brian. You talk how the flying columns were winning ground and they were clearly being very successful. Would it be fair to say that by 1921, by this period in 1921, that the volunteers had the ground forces on the run? I mean, did you think?
Yeah, to an extent, I think, because one of the phenomena that was happening in late 20, early 21 was the RIC were abandoning their rural barracks. Like they abandoned Milltown in October 1920, simply because the more isolated rural barracks were much more vulnerable to attack, and didn't offer the defences that the bigger barracks in the likes of Killarney, Killard and Tralee would have offered. So, there are several accounts of the. So, I mean, that's a good way of putting it to some extent, that the RIC and the ground forces were kind of on the run in some respects, in that they were retreating into the larger urban centres and really were losing their foothold, particularly in rural areas, most definitely.
Yes, and I think, like the whole court system and everything had collapsed at that stage.
That's true. Yeah.
The Dáil courts had taken over. Another question here, and I think, you've been asked this one before, I know, on at different occasions by Sean, about graves of, RIC and Black and Tans or so on being left unmarked after the war. Was Sgt Cullery's grave marked, and was it ever a source of difficulty locally?
Diego Sean Conastanto, if it's the Sean, I think it is. No, Sgt Cullery's. I only discovered this last week, actually, in speaking to Mary O'Neill, his granddaughter, that for 50 years after the ambush, Sgt Cullery's grave remained unmarked, and for the simple reason that the family feared that it might be vandalized or attacked in some way, and I think they were fearful of the political consequences of maybe erecting a headstone, and they only erected a headstone on his grave in the Abbey in 1971, 50 years after the ambush, when his wife Catherine was buried there with him, and 3 daughters are buried there with him as well. And I thought it was interesting that the family didn't feel able to mark where he was buried because of the political environment in the year subsequently, and even though the grandchildren and Sgt Cullery's children do recall being brought back to Milton on occasion to visit his grave, they didn't until the 1970s actually have a headstone there, which is
yeah, and it's interesting to think as well, he shares the same grave as some people who fought against him, It's just quite an interesting,
Several of them are buried in the Abbey with him. Edward Barrett from Milltown, John Carroll from Kildare, and some of the, as I've said, they're kind of buried side by side almost 100 years on, having been enemies in war all those years ago.
Yes, that's right. I think it shows how the threads of Irish history overlap so much.
Indeed.
We'll kind of wrap this up shortly. I just want a few final things. We heard on the radio last week about Dr. Dan Sheehan undertaking never again to get involved in politics after the trauma of this period. And you touched on some of what happened to some of the volunteers in terms of the Civil War. In terms of those that, who did serve the Civil War and go on to continue to live in Kerry or come back to Kerry, how many of them became active in politics afterwards, or how many of them, took up different careers, or did they just become farmers, or what kind of happened to them afterwards?
Quite a few. I mean, in summary, the majority of those involved would have gone anti-treaty during the Civil War, and would have, for the most part, continued to or have been involved in combat during the Civil War. One of the, in terms of politics that I mentioned, 2 of them, Jack Flynn from Castlemaine went into politics quite quickly and became a very successful and long-established Fianna Fáil TD. Johnny Connor for Clonard Public. But in a lot of cases, and there's evidence of this in the archives, immigration was the only option for a lot of these people, for political as well as economic reasons, I would think. So if you look at some of the addresses given in the military archives, they're USA, they're Australia, they're New Zealand, and even I think it's Edward Langford from who was in the Milton Company. There's 8 or 9 different addresses given for him in the United States, and you can see in the accounts that a lot of those who subsequently in later years applied for military pensions describe how they felt compelled or forced to immigrate, and I suppose they felt that the state which they had taken up arms to try and create wasn't a home for them, or couldn't either sustain them economically or certainly politically. They decided that they needed to get out. So immigration would certainly be a running theme. But even, as you mentioned, like in later life, I mean, Dan Mulvihill, I think probably was one of the last, he lived up till 1985, and even in his older years would speak very kind of fondly about his involvement in this period and about, and relay it to the troubles in Northern Ireland, which again, for some of those veterans of that period took on a great importance, and in some accounts I've seen, he talks about the outbreaks of the troubles in the north in the late 60s. So, but again, as I say, immigration and hard times for a lot of those involved is a running theme.
Yeah, I think probably the Ireland that they fought for wasn't necessarily the Ireland that they ended up with, you know. So
Indeed,
yeah. So I think that seems to be all the questions from the audience. Listen, we'll call it a night. So it's been a fascinating insight into an extremely interesting event that happened 100 years ago, a traumatic event for the local people, you know, that left consequences that we're still living with to a certain degree today. But I think the photograph you showed at the very end with Mary O'Neill and the grandson of the man who led the ambush on the day, I think brings home that kind of, you know, that reconciliation, and I suppose, you know, squaring the circle to a certain degree after this period. So on behalf of everybody here tonight, I'd like to take the opportunity to again plug the book. It's in all good bookshops and on Owen's website, and also to thank you very much for taking the time out to share it with us this evening.
Thanks very much, John. Thank you, and thanks to Liam.